Cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them, cannon in front of them, cannon volleying and thundering. Artillery had been the major killer during the Great War and would remain so in the Second World War as well. In the European and Mediterranean theater, more than 65% of casualties were caused by high explosives and shrapnel from detonating shells and mortar rounds. Let's look at artillery. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to a World War II special about artillery during the war. Or some of it, anyhow. The Great War featured the longest and most devastating artillery barrages the world had ever seen. Unbelievable quantities of shells and grenades were expended over hours, days, and even weeks at a time. Whole villages were simply shelled out of existence. And even the strongest fortresses eventually crumbled under the weight of continuous, unrelenting bombardment. Most military planners expected the second iteration to play out like the first, with overwhelming firepower being the decisive factor. And at the war's outbreak, the French army had the strongest field artillery in the world. A lot of it was reminiscent of the Great War, with box trail 75 and 155mm guns waiting behind static lines of defense for the Germans to march right into their kill zone. Had the Germans simply done that, they would have certainly been annihilated in front of the Maginot Line. Instead, it seemed for a while like mobility would actually win over firepower. The German army had lost most of its artillery according to the Treaty of Versailles, particularly their heavy guns. And without huge resources of things like steel, simply rebuilding the Kaiser's arsenal was out of the question. So they focused on a couple of major field pieces. At first, the Wehrmacht sought to mass-produce the 7.5cm Feldkanon 18 as the infantry's backbone. Although it was modernized for a new war, with the ability to fire high-explosive shells and hollow charges at a max range of around 9,400 meters, the 7.5 caliber was simply not worth it anymore. So, aside from short-barreled infantry support guns, the main pieces would be the 10.5 and 15cm howitzers. Although equally antiquated, they were reliable and they were rugged. They were typically designed with a conventional semi-automatic horizontal sliding breech block, hydro-pneumatic recuperator, and a monoblock tube, with a slotted cylindrical muzzle brake attached to it. With a continuous pull firing mechanism and cartridge case obturation, the howitzers could have an effective range of 10 to 13 kilometers. Aside from high explosives, they could also fire specialized anti-personnel rounds and smoke projectiles. Usually, the howitzers were kept in batteries of 3 or 4 and could deliver quite a punch against a single target that had to be destroyed in order to achieve a breakthrough. Problem was, especially on the Eastern Front, there was seldom just a single target, and providing neutralization or counter battery fire on the defensive was a numbers game the Germans could not hope to win. The second major problem was a crippling lack of modern motorization. Dragging several tons of guns through the mud with horses was grueling, slow, and exhausting. It was also a reason why the Germans barely went above the 15.5cm mark except for siege guns. The 17cm Canon 18 was for sure one of the best German guns out there, with an innovative double recoil system and a firing range of 30 kilometers, but it weighed more than 23 tons. Moving these things without trucks was nearly impossible. Rather light in comparison was the iconic 88, the 88mm high-velocity flat cannon. Initially, it was only an AA gun for the Luftwaffe until its tank-killing capabilities were revealed. It could actually fire a wide array of different ammunition types. It was equally capable of firing high-explosive rounds with a time or percussion fuse, or discarding sabots like the APC-BC shells. A direct hit by such an armor-piercing, capped ballistic shell made armor fold like paper, but it was not a gun you'd use in a traditional artillery role. The gaps were instead filled with mostly captured and often rebored guns they got from the French, the Czechs, or the Soviets. This was also the case for Germany's allies. The standard howitzer of the Italian army was still the Škoda 10cm M14, captured in large numbers from the Austro-Hungarians. Remember them? In 1918. Many of the other guns were equally ancient, like the French Canon 105, which was in service till Italy's surrender. Spoiler. Sure, there was some homemade stuff, like the pretty well-designed Ansaldo Canon Modello 35, which could fire a 45-kilo shell over 22 kilometers, but the Italian industry could not build the numbers needed to make them count. The Finns were also reliant on a wild mix of artillery pieces. Some records go as high as 70 different kinds of guns used during the continuation war. Initially, much of it was either German, Swedish like the 10.5 Canon M34, or Czech like the Škoda M15. But then the Finns also used what they could capture from the Red Army. Particularly these 76mm guns were widely used in many of its units. Speaking of the Red Army, their approach to artillery warfare was much different. After losing a lot of their equipment during the German advance in 1941 and 42, the Soviets had to rebuild much of their arsenal, which also gave them the chance to restructure and modernize on a large scale. Straight from the beginning, Soviet industry was able to mass produce like no one else in Europe. The backbone of the army was the 76mm regimental gun that I just mentioned. The 76.2mm ZIS-3 was built by the thousands. By the end of 1944, the Red Army fielded more than 41,000 76mm guns, and 17,000 of those were produced in that year alone. Overall, a rugged, reliable gun with a quick rate of fire and muzzle velocity. It also had the benefits of low weight and maneuverability in the field. Field guns especially, they have to shift positions pretty often because of counter-battery fire or just the changing nature of the battlefield. In addition, Soviet doctrine demanded that every single artillery piece had to have tank fighting capabilities, which the 76.2mm provided. Outfitted with AP and APHE shells, it was certainly a headache for many German AFVs, although weaker than its supposed surrogate, the 85mm D44. Other stable artillery guns on the roster were the M30 122mm howitzer and the A19 122mm cannon. The M30 was a typical howitzer with a hydraulic recoil buffer and a hydro-pneumatic recuperator, able to fire the heavy, high-explosive shells up to 6 times a minute. One major asset was its rubber wheels, set on a carriage with leaf spring suspension. This meant the gun could be rapidly towed into battle, where it took just 1 or 2 minutes to set up. Outfitted with BR-471 armor-piercing high-explosive shells, both of those 122mm guns were able to damage even the strongest German armor in the field. The immense production numbers and the high level of standardization allowed the Red Army to use their artillery in overwhelming force. Their problem was a lack of electronics, especially radios, and also a lack of training time for new recruits. This meant that a lot of their tactics were pretty old school, like large-scale opening barrages, which, are still deadly if used by surprise. Soviet doctrine said an enemy's defensive capabilities must be destroyed within a certain time frame, and with the maximum force of all available guns and ammunition. Like at the Battle of Orel in July 1943, at that point the largest artillery battle of the war. To break the German lines, the Soviets spent a whole month just watching, really observing and preparing. Enemy gun batteries had to be identified, as well as their alternative firing positions to which they could be relocated. The same went for the shelters, the trenches, whose coordinates were meticulously laid out. Soviet spotters used every method of ranging and instrumental calculation available to them because they knew that even small errors could render artillery fire completely useless. Acoustic intersections, aerial photography, geographic surveys, interrogation of prisoners, and a lot of watching and listening. And such thorough reconnaissance paid off eventually. The Soviets knew the location of every gun and battery, the assembly areas, the supply dumps, everything. It was so thorough that every Soviet artillery piece had a specific target assigned to it. The following bombardment of the Dudensk strongpoint was absolutely devastating. After a 2-hour bombardment, there was not a single German anti-tank gun left, and every pillbox, shelter, and battery was obliterated. The British had forgotten much of this Great War style of artillery warfare. After losing most of their heavy guns in the retreat before Dunkirk, their army had to painfully rebuild its arsenal without the backbone of a massive wartime industry behind it. Budget constraints in the 1930s had already crippled the once mighty artillery branch, so what the British focused on was mostly the excellent QF 25 pounder, as well as the versatile BL 4.5 and 5.5 inch guns. The 25 pounder Mark II is considered by many to be the best field gun of the war. Although 75mm was not standard caliber anymore, and the shell was lighter than the German 105, an effective range of nearly 12 kilometers and a maximum muzzle velocity of over 500 meters per second made that gun pretty useful in a lot of situations. Quick firing to suppression, for example, as its gunners were trained to fire 6 shots in such a rapid succession there was barely a break between the impacts. For additional neutralization and destruction, the medium BL 4.5 inch gun could fire a 25 kilo high explosive projectile over 18 kilometers. As I said though, the British had kind of forgotten how to use their big guns, and they were often distributed piecemeal. It took Bernard Montgomery to shake them up and reintroduce the old doctrine of the past, that once a worthy target was acquired, they should concentrate fire from as many guns available, no matter their size, caliber, or organizational affiliation. The effect of such a concentration of force was evident during El Alamein, where the British Army fired close to 1 million shells in 12 days of firing, contributing powerfully to breaking up the German attack. Throughout the war, the British would focus on mostly medium guns and field pieces. There were some heavier guns, like the older BL-6 and the 7.2-inch howitzers, but they were mostly sent to the Indian theater. Much of the modern heavy stuff was bought or borrowed from American stocks. The Americans had the best of both worlds, the industrial capacity and the technical know-how to build a sophisticated and powerful artillery arm. From 1939 until Operation Torch in 1942, the U.S. transformed into a mechanized juggernaut. The old French guns were replaced by modern 75mm and 105mm howitzers. Unlike the Germans, the U.S. had a plethora of prime movers like trucks and tracked vehicles like the 2.5-ton truck or the M5 tractor. Supply was also a non-issue, and it was rare that an artillery unit lacked high-quality shells. There was also the 155mm Long Tom, and the heaviest was the M1 240mm howitzer, which could toss a 160-kilo shell against a target whose presence was no longer requested. For that, the Americans also perfected the TOT, Time on Target system, combining all kinds of guns to take out a target. They meticulously calculated the exact time of flight of the shells from each caliber to its target, and then executed a countdown for the combined battery. The effect was a devastating storm of all kinds of different shells hitting the target at the same time. Now, while I'm on the subject of shell bursting effectiveness, the artillery war in the Far Eastern and Pacific theaters was waged quite differently, for obvious reasons. The jungle environment made general things like observation and the concentration and movement of guns difficult, if not sometimes outright impossible. The Americans would supplement their firepower with massive naval barrages, but the Japanese did not have that luxury in most battles. Their doctrines called for field artillery to be always as close to the front as possible to directly support the infantry. In open warfare on the Chinese mainland, they would mass their batteries in long lines with telephone lines in between. But inside the dank tropical rainforest, they need to keep the guns right behind the advancing force in order to support it. Since firing over trees and through the thick undergrowth was a massive headache, the Japanese simplified their system by keeping artillery literally within shouting range. Focusing on motion at all times. Japanese gun commanders had quite a large amount of personal freedom in finding their targets. This applied to guns like the typical 105mm Type 91 howitzer, which was solid, but the Japanese only built like 1,000 of them. Most of their artillery was rather short-barreled, close support pieces from the 1930s. It was the terrain they fought over that made the Japanese uninterested in pursuing much more sophistication. This lack of faith was, however, supplemented by sheer willpower. The Type 94 75mm mountain gun, for example, needed 18 men to carry under normal conditions. During the advance on Port Moresby, though, they carried several of them up the narrow mountain trails of the Owen Stanley Range, something which was inconceivable to the Allies. Well, there you have it, a quick and dirty overview of some of the main artillery guns used by some of the warring powers. It is, of course, impossible to cover every single gun or every single aspect of artillery warfare in such a short time. We could talk for hours about super heavy guns, rocket artillery, siege artillery, infantry support guns, mountain artillery, railway guns, experimental pneumatic weapons, and all of that stuff, and maybe one day we will. But for now, I shall leave it here. If you want to know more about siege tactics on the Eastern Front, which involves some pretty massive artillery use, you can click here for our video on that, and you can join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com, only one dot, patreon.com, to get more specials like this one and that one, because that is what finances them. See you next time.